All right, so today we're diving into the history of New York City.
Ooh, New York.
I know. You're probably thinking cliche, right? Skyscrapers and pizza.
Everyone knows New York.
Exactly. But trust me on this one. We're going way deeper, way beyond the tourist stuff. This city's past, it's wilder than you'd think.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Think about it. This is a crash course, a deep dive into a place where, honestly, a lot of crashing has happened over the centuries. We're talking big personalities clashing, epic struggles. We're going to unearth stuff even a lot of New Yorkers might not know.
All right, you've sold me. So much of what we hear about New York City is surface level. Let's get into those hidden layers.
And those layers go way back. I'm talking long before the first skyscraper was even a glimmer in someone's eye. Did you know that for centuries, the Lenape people called Manhattan home?
The Lenape. I admit I don't know much beyond it. They were the original inhabitants.
Right, but let's not downplay it. They weren't just inhabitants. Skilled is an understatement. We're talking established communities, trade routes, a deep understanding of the land that, frankly, puts a lot of us to shame these days.
Centuries, you said. That puts things in perspective. We often breeze over those years before European arrival, like the story only really starts when, well,
When the Europeans show up.
yeah, exactly.
Right?
But it's their land, and what always gets me is how much of their influence you can still see in New York City if you know where to look.
Oh, absolutely. Like, ever walk down Broadway? That's following an old Lenape trail. Or the Bronx River. It's almost like
Like their presence is woven into the very fabric of the city.
totally, like walking through a ghost of the past. But as with so many places, the arrival of Europeans changed everything. And in New York's case, it started with beaver pelts.
Beaver pelts. Now that's an interesting twist. I didn't see that coming.
Right. But it makes sense those things were incredibly valuable in Europe back then. The Dutch, always savvy business people, they saw an opportunity with all the beavers in the New York region. So they established trading posts, and bam, New Amsterdam is born.
New Amsterdam. Always loved that name. It just sounds so evocative, doesn't it? But I guess the beaver pelt part of the story isn't as romantic.
Maybe not for the beavers. But here's the thing about New Amsterdam that I find fascinating. It was incredibly diverse from the get-go.
Really? I always kind of assumed it was just, Dutch settlers.
Oh no, not at all. You had people coming from all over Europe. English, French, German, you name it. Even some folks from Africa ended up there. It was a melting pot from the very beginning.
Wow. Okay, so already we're seeing that this idea of New York as a cultural crossroads, it's not new at all. It's baked into its DNA from the very start.
Absolutely. And speaking of personalities, we got to talk about Peter Stuyvesant.
Stuyvesant. Wasn't he that stern-looking guy on...
Oh, yeah, he's the one with the amazing portrait. And he was the Director General of New Amsterdam for almost 2 decades, so a pretty big deal. But, Peter was kind of a stickler for the rules.
Oh, no, let me guess. No spitting on the sidewalks.
Worse, he outlawed bowling. Outlawed it.
Bowling. Seriously. That's amazing. What did he have against bowling?
I know, right? You'd think there were bigger issues in a brand new colony, but hey, that was Peter.
Can you imagine? Just like you're New York now, the Dutch must have been fuming.
I'd be demanding a recount on those beaver pelts if I were them. But it really does make you think, right? Like, just changing the name, it's not just symbolic. It's about power, culture, the whole trajectory of the city shifting in that moment.
Absolutely. And speaking of shifts in power, we can't forget about the big one, the American Revolution. Now, everyone knows about the Boston Tea Party, but when it came to standing up to the British, New York had its own rebellious streak.
Oh, yeah. This city was like a powder keg waiting to explode. I mean, the Sons of Liberty, those guys were organized. They were the original rabble-rousers, getting people fired up, printing pamphlets, staging protests, the whole 9 yards.
They were fearless. They knew what they were risking, speaking out against British rule like that. But they felt it was worth it, that the principles of liberty were at stake.
And when the war actually broke out, New York's location, well, let's just say it suddenly became very important, strategically speaking. Remember how we were talking about Peter Stuyvesant and how he fortified the city?
It all comes back around, doesn't it?
It always does. And the British, they knew that controlling New York meant controlling these vital waterways, the flow of trade, access to the colonies. It was a prime target, which is why.
Well, let's just say things didn't go so well for the Americans at the Battle of Long Island.
That was a tough one. Right across the East River in what's now Brooklyn, Washington and his troops really had their backs against the wall there. They barely managed to escape. Can you imagine? The future of the whole country hanging by a thread, and they're sneaking out under the cover of night. Talk about a close call.
And the city itself suffered under British occupation. Years of uncertainty, hardship, the fires, for one thing.
Oh, right, the fires. Nobody knows for sure how they started, but thousands of homes and businesses gone. Can you imagine the paranoia, the suspicion?
And then there were the prison ships.
Mm-hmm.
To deal with all the American prisoners of war, the British, they started using old ships anchored in the harbor as makeshift prisons.
Wait, prison ships?
Yeah, but not like any prison you'd imagine. These were floating dungeons, overcrowded, disease-ridden, horrific conditions. Thousands of people died on those ships.
It's a side of history you don't always hear about, you know. The human cost, the suffering behind the dates and battles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even under occupation, that New York spirit, that spark of defiance, it never went out. And finally, in 1783,
The British leave.
gone. Can you imagine the celebrations? After years of living under their thumb, New York was free again.
A fresh start. I bet there were some epic parties on the streets that day. What happens next? I mean, New York's officially back in the game, right?
More than back in the game, it's center stage. For a brief period, New York actually served as the capital of the brand new United States under the Articles of Confederation.
No way, really. I always forget that part. So Washington takes the oath of office right here in New York.
Right here. Although, as you know, the capital eventually moved to Philadelphia and then, of course, to Washington, D.C. But even without the official title, New York's ambitions were, well, very New York.
Always aiming high. But what really kicks things off, I mean, we're talking about a city on the verge of becoming a global powerhouse here.
And a lot of it comes down to one incredible feat of engineering, the Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal. Okay, now that's thinking big.
It was revolutionary. Think about it. Connecting the Great Lakes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean via the Hudson River. It was like opening up a superhighway for trade right through New York. Goods flowing in and out, people coming from all over.
And New York City is sitting right there at the mouth of it all, perfectly positioned to become.
The gateway to America.
Which, of course, it does. And people from all over the world, they hear opportunity calling and they come flooding in.
Waves and waves of immigrants. And all those people, they need places to live, work, food to eat. The city's bursting at the seams. It was a time of incredible growth, but also chaos.
Oh, I bet. You can just imagine, right? The streets are packed, housing is scarce, sanitation, probably not great.
Not exactly. Something had to be done. And that's where one of the most ambitious, controversial, and frankly impactful plans in urban planning history comes in the links. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811.
The Commissioner's Plan. All right, hit me with it. What did these guys come up with?
Imagine this. They proposed to impose a grid system on the entire island of Manhattan.
A grid. Wait, you're saying just straight lines, right angles, like the complete opposite of the winding streets they had back there.
Exactly. Order out of chaos. It was a radical idea.
Wow, a grid. I mean, looking at a map of Manhattan now, it seems so obvious, but back then it must have sounded crazy.
Oh, it caused an uproar. Some people, they saw the grid as visionary, bring order to all that chaos, make the city more efficient. But others,
They weren't so happy.
let's just say, not everyone trusted those commissioners. They saw it as a power grab, a way for wealthy developers to buy up land, push out the folks who'd been there all along.
And knowing New York, there are probably some pretty epic backroom deals going on, too.
Oh, I'm sure. And this is where we have to talk about Tammany Hall.
Tammany Hall. Okay, so whenever I hear that name, I think like old-timey political corruption, backroom deals, smoke-filled rooms, all that.
It's practically a cliche at this point, right? But Tammany Hall, they were the ones in control for decades. They were masters at this sort of, let's call it practical politics.
Practical, like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of thing.
Exactly. They knew how to get things done, but they also knew how to take care of their own.
Mm.
Jobs, favors, sometimes a little intimidation if you weren't playing ball. They were the original kingmakers.
But weren't they also looking out for the everyday New Yorker? Like, especially the immigrants coming in?
Oh, for sure. They understood that those new arrivals, they needed help, they needed a leg up. Tammany Hall provided that. But again, always for a price.
It's that classic mix, right? Good intentions, questionable methods. But like you said, they were in charge for a long time, so something was working. So what changed?
Well, the early 1900s, it was a time of immense change, social upheaval. People were starting to demand more from their leaders, more fairness, more safety. And one event really brought all of that to a head, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
That was horrific. Over 140 people killed, most of them young women, immigrants working in terrible conditions.
It was a wake-up call for the city. Suddenly, all those issues that had been simmering, labor rights, workplace safety, they were front and center. People took to the streets. demanded change.
And it did lead to reforms, right? New laws, better conditions.
Absolutely. It's a tragic but recurring theme in New York's history. Sometimes it takes a tragedy to force real progress.
It's like the city learns and grows from these incredibly difficult moments, but it always bounces back, doesn't it? I mean, the 1920s, that was the Jazz Age. New York was the center of the world.
Oh, the energy, the music, the art, the culture just exploding. It felt like anything was possible in New York City during the Roaring '20s.
And then, well, the party came to a crashing halt with the Great Depression.
It was brutal.
Right.
The city that never sleeps, suddenly it felt like it was grinding to a standstill. Unemployment, poverty, the images from that time are heartbreaking.
But even in the darkest times, you see this spirit in New Yorkers. They don't give up. They find a way. And I guess that's where someone like Fiorello LaGuardia comes in.
Ah, LaGuardia. Now, there was a mayor for the people. He came in during the Depression, and he was a fighter. He knew people were hurting, and he was determined to do something about it.
He took on corruption, stood up for the working class, helped create the systems that would protect the most vulnerable New Yorkers.
He really set the stage for the New York we know today, in a lot of ways. And then there's Robert Moses. Now, that's a whole other deep dive.
The master builder. His fingerprints are all over the city, parks, highways, bridges. You can't go far without seeing something Moses had a hand in.
He had a vision, that's for sure, but it was a vision that didn't always consider everyone equally. Some of his projects, well, they displaced communities, favored cars over people, His legacy is complicated.
It makes you think, doesn't it, about the trade-offs we make in the name of progress, whose voices get heard, whose don't. It's a conversation we're still having today, not just about New York, but about cities everywhere.
And then, of course, there's September 11th, a day that changed everything.
It's hard to even put into words, the shock, the grief, the fear, but also in the aftermath, that incredible surge of resilience, of compassion, of New Yorkers coming together to support each other, rebuild.
We saw the true spirit of New York City on that day, and in the days and weeks that followed. This city, it's been through so much, and yet it always comes out stronger.
So if you're ever lucky enough to find yourself wandering the streets of New York, remember, you're not just walking through a city, you're walking through centuries of history. Every corner has a story, every building a witness to the past.
It's a city that never stops changing, never stops reinventing itself. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive, it's that the story of New York City, it's your story too. We're all part of this ongoing narrative, shaping the future with every step we take.
New York City, a place of endless possibility, a testament to the human spirit. This is the deep dive, reminding you to never stop exploring, questioning, and uncovering the hidden stories all around us.
Thank you for listening. If you love history, don't forget to subscribe to History with Bree and Peter. Join us for more fascinating stories from the past. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode.